Brian, would you like to say a few words?
So does this work? Yes. We face a serious educational crisis in the world today. The crisis is that the rest of the world understands the West, the civilization, the literature, the religions, the philosophy of the West, much better on average than the West understands the rest of the world. To put it in a simple slogan, the rest understands the West better than the West understands the rest. So in my remarks today, I'd like to say something about how we got into this situation and what we can do to get out of it. Now, if you look back at European philosophy textbooks as late as the 18th century, there were three common views about how philosophy originated in the world. One of the common views in European philosophy textbooks up through the 18th century was that philosophy originated in Africa. And from Africa, philosophy was given as a gift to the Greek world. A second major view was that philosophy began in India, and from India, philosophy migrated to ancient Greece. Now, I'm sure you all can imagine what the third major view was about the origin of philosophy. It was that philosophy developed independently in both India and Africa, and both of them gave it to ancient Greece. The view that philosophy began independently in ancient Greece, much less that it began uniquely in ancient Greece, was considered a weird fringe view in European philosophy as late as the 18th century. So, given this open-minded attitude, it's no surprise that when people first learned about Chinese philosophy, they were very receptive to it and very excited about it. The sayings of Confucius and his immediate disciples are called in English the Analects, in Chinese the Lunyu. And the first translation of the sayings of Confucius into a European language was done by Jesuit missionaries. And the Jesuits have extensive familiarity with Western philosophy as part of their training. And they translated the sayings of Confucius into Latin with the title Confucius Sonorum Philosophus, Confucius, the Chinese philosopher, because they immediately recognized that Confucianism was philosophic and very interesting philosophy at that. It wasn't just the Jesuits who were excited about Confucianism as a philosophy. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who appears on any standard history of modern Western philosophy curriculum, was a true Sinophile. And in fact, he said that Confucian ethics were better than Western ethics. He added, though it is shameful for us to admit this. He said that Confucian ethics are more suited to the life of mortals like us, as opposed to the less realistic Western ethics. Leibniz was also fascinated because Leibniz, of course, invented binary arithmetic, which is the basis of computers. So the next time you use a computer, thank a philosopher. You're welcome. But Leibniz, when he learned about the I Ching, the classic of changes, the Chinese divination and philosophy text that describe situations using hexagrams, collections of 6 broken or unbroken lines, Leibniz recognized broken and unbroken lines are essentially zeros and ones. And he said, my God, they invented binary arithmetic before I did. Well, given all the excitement about Chinese philosophy, obviously Chinese philosophy continued to be a standard part of the Western philosophy curriculum up to the present day. No, it didn't. Why not? The simple answer, I'm afraid, is Immanuel Kant. Now, Immanuel Kant was undeniably a brilliant philosopher, and in some ways I consider myself a Kantian, and many people have found emancipatory ideas in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And Kant certainly did not invent the notion of pseudo-scientific racism, but he bought into it once he discovered it. It's not as well known because he doesn't write about it mostly in his more well-known works, but in his lectures, he ranked the races hierarchically, with whites at the top. Whites, Kant informs us, contain all talents and motives in themselves. And so they are the only race capable of philosophy. And you'll have to pardon my language here, but I'm just repeating what Kant said. Sometimes we have to look at ugly things to confront them. Kant said, Hindus look like philosophers, but they are incapable of abstract thought, and so will never achieve science or philosophy. Obviously, Kant had never read a single work of Indian philosophy, or he'd know better, or Indian science for that matter. Kant said the Chinese are on the same level as the, again, pardon my language, the Hindus, because their own books tell us that they have not advanced a single bit beyond what their sages came up with thousands of years ago. The Africans, Kant tells us, are, Kant's language, chatty and vain, and can only be trained to be servants. And he said the indigenous people of the America, according to Kant, don't talk and are infertile, a claim which on the face of it has to be false of the human beings who occupied the Americas before Europeans came in. Now, you might say, okay, so Kant's he was a racist, but we don't read those works anymore. Who cares? The reason we should care is that Kant was a great philosopher who transformed Western philosophy, and his disciples rewrote the philosophy textbooks in Europe. And they wrote Asia, Africa, and the indigenous traditions of the America out of the philosophy textbooks. Now, the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of my colleagues in philosophy would reject the explicit racism of Kant's account. But they accept the tainted fruit of Kant's account, which is the unargued assumption that there never was any philosophy in any tradition besides the tradition that goes back to Plato and Aristotle. And just a quick digression on this point, occasionally my colleagues in philosophy will say, well, Brian, why do you have to bring racism into this? You know, why do you think it's about racism? Isn't it just about ignorance? I can't tell you how many times I have said to people things like, have you considered hiring someone in Chinese philosophy? And they say, well, there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy. And I ask them, well, what have you read that is considered Chinese philosophy that you disagree is philosophy? And they say, oh, I haven't read any, but I just know there isn't any. And I know the same things happens with Indian philosophy, with African philosophy, with indigenous American philosophy. People feel they don't have to read it. They know a priori it doesn't exist. That is why this is about structural racism. So what's been the effect of Kant? There are only about 13% of the doctoral programs in philosophy in the United States. Is there anybody on staff who can competently supervise a dissertation on Chinese philosophy? And there is not a single Ivy League university that has anyone in its philosophy department capable of supervising a dissertation on Chinese philosophy. Now, the situation of Indian philosophy is a little more complicated. Here at Columbia, it's one of the few doctoral programs in philosophy where you can actually study Indian philosophy. They have an assistant professor, I hope they tenure her someday, who covers Indian philosophy. But overall, there are fewer places where you can study South Asian or Indian philosophy in the United States than there are places where you can study Chinese philosophy. African philosophy, about in the same boat as Indian philosophy. My friend Ricardo Pazzo mentioned Kwasi Wiredu, who passed away just a few years ago. He was one of the few scholars in the United States teaching African philosophy, and he's passed away. As for indigenous American philosophy, last time I checked, there were 3 doctoral programs where you could study the thought of the people who lived in the Americas before the Europeans came in. So what can we do about this? Well, I wrote a book, Taking Back Philosophy, and I argued in this book, if you liked some of the documentation for the claims I've just made, or learned, or some quick responses to some of the tedious and fallacious arguments against teaching Chinese or African or Indigenous American or South Asian philosophy in philosophy departments, I talk about that in Taking Back Philosophy. But in the book, I say we need to take back philosophy in two senses. We need to take back philosophy to the cosmopolitan ideal that originally motivated philosophy. Plato knew there were interesting ideas in other cultures and he wanted to learn about them. Most people knew this until the beginning of the modern era. So we need to take philosophy back to its cosmopolitan roots, its cosmopolitan and multicultural roots. Also, I think we should take philosophy back to its roots as something concerned with philosophy as a way of life. Too often, especially in the English-speaking world, philosophy has become a bunch of intellectual parlor games where people are willing to fight to the death over the question of whether the sentence, "the current king of France is bald," is false or neither true nor false. I have a colleague from graduate school who wrote a whole book about that. I'm not making that up. This is a real thing philosophers like to argue about instead of the meaning of life. And when you think about philosophy in a cosmopolitan way and about the meaning of life, what you recognize is that there are four topics that people discuss across many, many civilizations. What is the right way to live? What is the best way of life? In English, we technically refer to that as human flourishing. And in Chinese, you would refer to it as randao, the way of a human. Or in ancient Greek, you'd refer to it as eudaimonia. Or in Latin, you'd refer to it as beatitudo, similar concept across different cultures. How they fill that concept out is often different, but they're interested in that topic. And if you care about ways of life, then you're also going to care about the personality traits, the character traits you need to live that way of life. In English, we call those virtues. In Chinese, they call them de, or in modern Chinese, mei de. In Greek, they call them arete, and in Latin, they call them virtu. And if you care about virtues, you have to care about how you cultivate the virtues. And in English, we just call that ethical cultivation. In Chinese, you could say shouyang. In Greek, you'd say paideia, and in Latin, you'd say humanitas. And of course, if you're caring about cultivating virtues so you can live a way of life, you care about what is human nature like so that it's possible to live that way of life and cultivate those virtues. And we talk about human nature in English, which comes from the Latin natura, which is their version of the Greek physis, and in Chinese you talk about renxing, human nature. So we find different answers to common questions. And in an interconnected, multipolar world, we need to understand what other people think on these topics and not just deal in memes or caricatures of what they think. Now, if you'd like some concrete recommendations about how to make education multicultural, when the G7 nations met recently in Italy, they called together a group of leading philosophers and me glad you laughed at that, to develop a statement on the needs of philosophy going forward. And we wrote in the city of Barletta, the Barletta Declaration on Philosophy and Interculturality. And you can find it on my website, bryanvannoorden.com. That's BRYANVANNORDEN.com. Sorry, I'm misspelling it, but for some reason people find my name incredibly difficult to spell. I don't mind, but you won't find the web. But if you just looked up Barletta Declaration, it should take you to my website. I also have links there to syllabi and readings for different kinds of philosophy. So I'd like to end with an anecdote that I think kind of illustrates, and I say the Barletta Declaration will give you some concrete suggestions for how to achieve multicultural philosophy. But I'd like to end on an anecdote. There's a European university that had a bit of controversy recently. This European university, there was this young upstart philosopher who wanted to introduce a new figure to the philosophical curriculum. And a lot of the conservatives on the faculty said, well, this guy's not a part of our tradition. and you're watering down the curriculum with all these non-canonical thinkers and texts. Students literally almost rioted about this change in the curriculum. The university I'm talking about is the University of Paris. The debate I'm talking about took place in the 13th century. The young upstart philosopher was St. Thomas Aquinas, and he was trying to introduce Aristotle back into the European philosophical curriculum because his works had been lost, but fortunately preserved in the Islamic world. And now they were being translated into Latin. And by the way, there's some evidence that Aquinas only worked from Latin translations of Aristotle's works. And there are plenty of translations of Indian and Chinese and African and indigenous American philosophy. And for me, what's really exciting about Thomas Aquinas is that Aquinas was someone who had his own Christian faith, but he wanted to learn from pagans like Plato and Aristotle. He wanted to learn from Jews like Maimonides. He wanted to learn from Muslims like Avicenna and Averroes. And he recognized that respecting his own tradition was completely consistent with loving and learning from other traditions as well. And that approach, the way I would summarize that is to use lines from the great Latin poem Terence, who, and this is an English translation, of course, Terence said, "I am a human, and nothing human is alien to me." Or, as Kongzi's disciple Zisha said, "四海之内，皆兄弟也." Within the four seas, all are brothers. Thank you.
Let me just add, it's a wonderful panel, and everybody is engaged in it. And this discussion does not happen in the UN Security Council. It does not happen at the G20. It does not happen among world leaders. It does not happen among generals. This is a very serious problem, which is that we are not having a philosophical discussion about the kind of world that we want among people who are determining our lives and deaths. And that, I think, is extremely pertinent and serious. There has been no philosophical discussion about the war in Gaza. There has been no philosophical discussion about the war in Ukraine among the people who are dropping the bombs or choosing whether to drop the bombs or to find a different way or to find a different approach. And this, to me, is why this discussion is also extremely pertinent. Of course, it's pertinent for our children. It's pertinent for how we live. It's pertinent for how we hope young people will live and learn, because they're going to be in a very diverse and global world. But we're also at a point of, as the doomsday clock says, 90 seconds to midnight, and we don't have the most basic appreciation of other societies, and don't even know that we don't, and don't even know how to get it. So there are assumptions made every day here about what the Chinese are going to do so that we can have a war by 2027, says the US Navy. This is insanity. And this is the level of stupidity, I'll use a harsh word, but that we really are governed by right now. Now, one of the things and by the way, just the list of issues that came up that are philosophical issues as well as economic or political or sociological or any other category: migrants, marginalized populations, post-colonial populations, clash of civilizations, future generations, relations to the biosphere. These are all intrinsically deeply philosophical issues that are not so much discussed in a philosophical way in places where it needs to be. One of the things as I studied more and more philosophy, one of the things that I came to love about philosophy is that the great philosophers that we know of were not sitting in classrooms. They're all failed politicians, almost all of them. or even better, from my point of view, failed policy advisors. I love the fact that Plato failed 3 times in trying to advise the Syracusa in Sicily, because if he can fail, it gives us license for all of us to fail. One of the times he was nearly arrested and sold off to slavery, but he escaped at the last moment, so I'm just trying to take notes. Well, I was going to say that Confucius spent his whole life up to age 70 going from kingdom to kingdom, being ignored, basically. Until he sat down with his disciples and then taught for the next 2,000 years what to do. But during his lifetime, he was mostly ignored. Machiavelli wrote The Prince as basically a job application to get the job back with the Medici. Locke, these are not all my favorites, but because they wrote for patrons, the Earl of Shaftesbury in that case, and he was secretary for the Carolinas. And John Stuart Mill worked for 40 years for the East India Company. I don't think he got a lot right out of that particular part of his career. But the idea is we need to bring this discussion in a very practical way also, in a rather urgent way. And it's very, very rich. And our assumptions about how others behave are very culturally determined by our own views. I think one of the things Pope Francis teaches the most, by the way, is what his encyclical Fratelli Tutti is about, and that is encounter. And the idea is that if you really want a philosophical approach, listen to the other and know how to make that encounter. And that encyclical is dedicated, it's the first ever, I think, Catholic papal encyclical dedicated to a Muslim leader. It's dedicated to the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. And it opens actually with a description of St. Francis of Assisi, and this is a historical truth, traveling on foot basically in ship to Damietta, Egypt, in the 5th Crusade in 1219 to meet with the Sultan Kamil al-Malik to try to make peace between the Christians and the Muslims on the battlefield. And he had an all-night discussion with the Sultan. Peace did not come in that way, but it was another encounter that was extraordinary. So I want to thank all the panelists and all the philosophers, and Jian Yu, a colleague on our practical side of things, but philosophical in his own right, for how rich this is, how meaningful it is, how important it is, and how much we have to really propel it into active political discourse as well, because this is not only philosophical, to put it in quotation marks, this is the most practical, and that's how philosophy has always been. That was the tradition, practical, and we need it practically speaking today more than ever. So, thank you.